So one of the possible tasks that you could get in your IGCSE exam this summer is to write a leaflet. So we're going to think about what we need to do in order to do that successfully. First of all, as we're thinking about what kind of tasks they could give you, I've just made up a few here, so we'll just go through them. I don't know what they're going to ask you to do exactly, but just thinking about a range of possible tasks just gets your mind working in the right direction, doesn't it? So I've put write a leaflet persuading young people in your local area to take up a new sport. Write a leaflet which could be found in a local GP surgery, giving advice on how to give up smoking and explaining why it is important to do so. Write a leaflet persuading people visiting your local area to go to a tourist attraction or to visit a particular town or village. Write a leaflet persuading people in your area to donate to a local charity. Write a leaflet to be distributed at your school's open day, giving information to parents about your school and persuading them to apply for a place for their son or daughter. And the key thing, I think, with any of these tasks, and you'll need to do this when you're in the exam, is the first thing to think about is the audience and the purpose, or the purposes. So who is the audience, first of all? So could it be young people in your local area? Could it be people in your school? Could it be visitors to a local GP surgery? Could it be tourists? Could it be parents? You know, what does the question tell you about the age or the type of people, or what do we know about the people who are actually going to pick up this leaflet or receive it in the post or whatever and going to read it? Okay, because the moment you started thinking about your audience, well, that's going to affect how you're going to write it, the kind of style you're going to use and what content you're going to include. Okay, so audience, try to think, who is this aimed at? The second thing is purpose or purposes. Now, it might use a kind of purpose word in the question, in the task. So it might use a word like inform, explain, persuade, advise, or you might have to kind of read between the lines to work out what they're asking you to do. But if it uses a word like persuading or to give advice or to explain, then I would underline that and just think, okay, so that's what I'm aiming to do. It's probably asking you to give information as well. So even if it doesn't use the word inform, you've got to probably include information, otherwise you can't give people advice or you can't persuade them. Do you see what I mean? It's very difficult to persuade someone to do something unless you've given them some information about it. Okay, so try and think, what are the purposes? And it could be a mixture. It could be to inform and explain and persuade and maybe give a bit of advice as well. So don't limit yourself here. Try to think, there could be a range of different things I'm going to be aiming to do in this leaflet. But they're two really important things, the audience and the purpose. The third thing I would say is, and I've kind of touched on that already, is the context. So in what context will someone be reading this? Will they be on holiday? Will they be visiting your school for an open day? Will they be visiting a GP surgery? Will they receive it shoved through their door as a piece of junk mail? In what context are they going to receive this leaflet or choose to pick it up and then read it? And again, that will affect the kind of things you write about and the way in which you try to make it effective. I've got a leaflet here, which is from an old Edexcel anthology, actually. So I thought this would be a good one to look at. You don't get that many leaflets nowadays, do you? Because I suppose people tend to use the internet now for the kind of thing that used to be reliant on leaflets for. If you wanted to find out about lifeguards and about the RNLI, well, you'd go on their website, wouldn't you? But we still do find leaflets, don't we? Particularly if you're visiting a hotel or a particular area, then you might find it about tourist destinations. As I said, like in a GP surgery, you might find it about how to avoid getting hay fever, or if you go and visit somewhere, they might hand you a leaflet like at a school open day or whatever. It's the kind of situation where you might get given one. So let's look at this as an example. It says, on the beach, your guide to a safe and fun time at the seaside. At the bottom, it's got this sort of slogan, hasn't it, which it repeats throughout the leaflet. So it says, RNLI lifeboats, lifeguards, life first. And it's got that at the bottom of lots of the pages. It's got a few little boxes. It's trying to use some colour. You don't need to worry too much about the graphological elements here, the layout, there are a few things that you need to show that you've got some awareness of, to show that you're thinking about the form of what you're writing, but you don't need to start going overboard about that. So please don't start getting colours out and you know, colouring boxes in and drawing it in some intricate way. That's going to be a waste of time, and in fact it will probably just irritate an examiner. There's a few little things that we can do just to show that we're aware of form, but we'll come on to that a bit later. Let's have a look at this bit under where it says true story. It says Caroline Yard will never forget her holiday in June 2007. It was our last day and I was relaxing on the beach with my daughter and friend Mark. My sons Angus and Will were swimming in the sea, but Mark noticed that the boys had been swept towards some rocks and they started shouting for help. They're big teenagers who don't usually call for their mum, so I knew something was seriously wrong. They were caught in a strong rip current and they couldn't swim back to shore. The water was like a whirlpool. They were so close and yet in so much trouble. Mark and a surfer called Mike got in the water to help while I dialed 999 for the Coast Guard on my mobile phone. They called the RNLI lifeguards from the neighbouring beach. It only took minutes for the rescue boat to arrive, but when you think your boys are going to drown, it seems to take a lifetime. I lost sight of them, which was terrifying. One of the lifeguards, Bernadette, jumped into the water. Mike had helped Angus to get to one side of the current, and Bernadette helped them both up onto a rock. Then she guided Mark and Will out of the current and between the rocks. Angus and Will were shaking with shock. I was crying and just so relieved that we were all back together safely. It still makes me cry when I think about it. I'll certainly always go to a lifeguard patrolled beach in future, and I know the boys will too. I will be eternally grateful to the lifeguards. If they hadn't been there that day, my boys would have drowned. Now that's quite an interesting little section, and I would suggest that you need to try to have a section a bit like that, where you're seeking the opportunity to either tell a story or to describe a location or something in detail, an experience, whatever it happens to be, because you need some sustained writing in this leaflet. If you're not careful, it could become very, very bitty, just lots of little headings and subheadings and bullet points, and you've got to give yourself the opportunity to develop some paragraphs and some sections in detail, and that's what that section does. We'll come back to it a bit later. The rips bit, this is where you've got some bullet points, and can you see it says rips are strong currents that can quickly take swimmers from the shallows out beyond their depth. One of the things that does there is it glosses some specialist vocabulary, and by glossing I mean doing what you get in a glossary. So if you think sometimes at the bottom of a text you have a glossary, don't you, and you have some complicated words that were in the text, and then it gives you the definitions of some of them. What a glossary does is it glosses, so it explains what some words might mean that some readers might not be familiar with. Now you might know what a rip is, or a rip current, but actually some readers might not. Okay, so it explains what they are, so it's showing an awareness of the audience there, that they might have read Caroline's little account there but not know what a rip is, and so they're thinking, oh, what's a rip current, what does that mean? Okay, so it's kind of explaining it so that everyone who reads the leaflet can be familiar with what's being spoken about. And you need to think, are there some words that I'm using if you're writing a leaflet about rugby? Are there some terms that you might know, but actually some of the readers might not be familiar with? Are there some terms if you're writing a leaflet about your school? Are there some terms that readers might not know, what they mean? So for instance, I don't know, like when I first came to Seaford and people were talking about the SAN, I had absolutely no idea what a SAN was. Okay, because I'd always, in previous schools, I've said, right, go to the medical office or go to the nurse. So there are lots of little terms that we use in Seaford, aren't there? And if you were writing a leaflet about Seaford as a school, then you might want to use some of those terms, but also explain what they mean so that readers who don't go to Seaford are familiar with them. Okay. It's then got those bullet points, doesn't it? So it's got a series of instructions, really. So it says, stay calm, don't panic. If you can stand, wade, don't swim. Keep hold of your board or inflatable to help you float. Raise your hand and shout for help. Never try to swim directly against the rip or you'll get exhausted. Swim parallel to the beach until free of the rip, then make for shore. If you see anyone else in trouble, alert the lifeguards or call 999 or 112 and ask for the Coast Guard. Can you see it's constantly using these imperative verbs, these commanding verbs like stay, keep, raise, swim, alert. So probably in a leaflet, you're going to be using some of those imperative verbs at some point, because the leaflet is probably designed to get someone to do something, to apply for a place for their son or daughter at Seaford College, or to give up smoking, or to contact the organisation to get more information, to give some money, to whatever. Okay, and so at some point you're probably going to need to use these imperatives in these directive sentences. Okay. We've then got a section which says know your flags. So it's got what the different flags mean. Then we've got a swimming, surfing and bodyboarding bit. It says swimming is one of the best all-round activities you can do, but the sea is very different from being in a pool. Even small waves can take you by surprise and disorientate you. That word disorientate is quite interesting, isn't it? Because one of the things with writing a leaflet is that if you're not careful, you'll write something that's very dumbed down. Whereas there are some kind of complex words and expressions here sometimes. So words like disorientate, or in the section on the right under the RNLI, when it's talking about funding, it talks about legacies and financial support. You know, there are some more complex examples of vocabulary being used, and you need to show that you know a range of vocabulary. So you need to try to seek opportunities to do that when you're writing a leaflet. So it's got some sections there about the RNLI, about lifeboats and lifeguards, and then it's got a section on the right there. It says beaches need lifeguards. I'll just read that bit for you. It says our lifeguards work with lifeboat crews to provide a seamless rescue service from the beach to the open sea. When someone is drowning in the surf, seconds count, so we need expert lifesavers on the beach ready to act. As much as 95% of our lifeguards' work is preventative. That is, they look out for potential problems before they develop into something worse and give proactive advice and information to beachgoers. Can you see those words preventative and proactive? That's actually reasonably complex vocabulary there. You've got to seek opportunities to use words like that. The RNLI aims to continue expanding its lifeguard service across the whole country, but we can't achieve this without support from the public. Every year it costs £450 to equip and £900 to train each lifeguard. Will you help us meet that need? You see there's a few things there. First of all, there's a couple of moments where they've used some statistics. So about the 95% of lifeguards work and the amount it costs to train a lifeguard. It's using statistics within their argument, which is designed to persuade you to give some money towards the RNLI. Okay, and it's also using a rhetorical question then, isn't it? Will you help us meet that need? Yeah, so have a think about using the kind of techniques really that you would use in an article or a speech. Think about a persuasive speech. You'd be thinking about using all sorts of persuasive language, wouldn't you? Things like lists of three and rhetorical questions. Just because it's a leaflet doesn't mean you can't use all those techniques somewhere. Try to force the examiner to reward you for doing those things. Okay, some techniques and tips then. You need a heading and you need some subheadings, and try to make sure that you don't want too many, but you want to maybe have, let's say, 4 main sections of your leaflet, something like that. And try to be creative about your heading and your subheadings. See if you can include some humour or some alliteration or some wordplay or some rhyme somewhere. An examiner will notice that and think, oh, they've thought about grabbing the audience's attention. And the same goes for the slogan. It was in a list of 3, wasn't it, to do with the lifeguards in the RNLI one. Can you come up with some catchy slogan that maybe could be at the bottom of each of the pages? Frequently answered questions is a way in which you often find that kind of page, don't you, on a website, on a web page, or on a leaflet, where they're kind of anticipating the questions that a reader might ask, and then answering them, and it gives you just a different way of structuring one of the sections maybe. Do definitely make sure you have a section of sustained narrative and/or description, and this is your opportunity to use similes and emotive language and lists of 3 and sensory description, what you can hear, smell, see, taste and touch, try to use all the kind of techniques that you used when you did your imaginative writing. Just because this is a leaflet and it's transactional writing, and the word transactional sounds really boring, doesn't mean you can't use all the same techniques, but just in slightly different places and in slightly different ways. Okay, but show off, use some similes or metaphors and, you know, really original adjectives and description. Use some bullet points, but don't overdo it. Use some imperatives, but don't overdo it. Glossing specialist vocabulary, we said the pronoun we can be effective, can't it? So we look forward to welcoming you at Legoland. You know, we all find it difficult to kick a habit of a lifetime. You know, if you're talking about giving up smoking, the word we can often be really effective. Think about where you might be able to use that. Statistics and facts, comparatives and superlatives. A comparative is a word that either has more before it or er after it. So if you have big, bigger, biggest, okay, then big is just a basic adjective, isn't it? Then bigger is a comparative, biggest is a superlative. Or if it's a longer word, we don't say beautiful, beautifuler, beautifulest, do we? We say beautiful, more beautiful is the comparative, most beautiful is the superlative. Now, because probably you're going to be writing in a kind of persuasive, maybe an emotive way in this leaflet, use of comparative and superlatives is probably going to be important. So think about slipping them in and where and how you could use them. And then also rhetorical questions. Okay, a few do's and don'ts. Don't overuse bullet points. If you want to use a few to emphasize something, that's a good technique, because that's the kind of thing that you get in a leaflet. But if you start using them on every page all the time, it just becomes really bitty and irritating. It's the same with exclamation marks. If you want to use a couple at some point for a couple of sentences because you really want to emphasize humor or shock or urgency or something, then fine, but don't use them 10 times in a leaflet. It's like being slapped around the face constantly if someone keeps using exclamation marks all the time. There's a word for it. It's called bangaria. It's a bit like diarrhea, but with exclamation marks. Don't be incontinent with your exclamation marks. Absolutely ridiculous. Just use one or two for effect. Otherwise, they're not effective. Okay. Don't split your page up to look like a leaflet. Put your ruler away. Okay, an examiner's not interested. You can do a couple of things to make it look like a leaflet. You can have a heading and a few subheadings. Okay, 4 of them maybe. Okay, and maybe a couple of times you could put a box in the corner of the page or something and say picture of such and such. Okay, or if you've got an idea for the colours that you would want it to be used, just somewhere in brackets on the page put this page would be in these colours because. Okay, maybe it fits in with the theme. If you're writing about the environment and you particularly want to use green for the subheadings or something, that's a conscious, effective thing to have put in brackets somewhere. Okay, but put your coloured pencils away, put your ruler away. Don't start dividing up your page and folding it up and all that ridiculous business. Okay, it's the text that they're interested in. Do find a section or two where you can show off your ability to narrate or to describe. As I said, use the same techniques that you used in your imaginative writing coursework and an examiner will be impressed. Do make sure that at least some of your paragraphs are decent, juicy, chunky, well-developed ones with 5 or 6 sentences in so that the whole thing doesn't become too bitty. Okay, we need to be able to see that you can write in proper paragraphs. And if everything is just these odd little sentences on their own, an examiner's not going to be able to see that and you're not going to be able to get the highest grades. So some of the paragraphs need to be decent, juicy, chunky ones. Yeah. Do think about appealing to your audience and considering counter arguments. We're going to think about that a little bit on the next slide, but thinking about what objections your audience might have, what questions have they got, what arguments have they got about why they shouldn't send their child to Seaford, why they shouldn't donate to this charity, why they shouldn't give up smoking, whatever it happens to be. Do use every sentence as an opportunity to impress the examiner. And if you've written the last 3 or 4 sentences and there's nothing in any of them that you think an examiner is going to tick, well, why were you writing them? Okay, there's got to be something in every sentence or two that you think, yeah, the examiner's going to reward me for that list of 3. The examiner's going to reward me for that simile. The examiner is going to be impressed with that word, with that piece of humour, with that use of alliteration, with the way in which I'm developing my argument there. There's got to be something, otherwise don't write it. Okay, what you want to force an examiner to constantly be ticking the page. Yeah, so try to look for opportunities constantly to be impressing them. Do use adventurous vocabulary, so at least 10 words that you're really proud of, even if you haven't spelt them correctly. Don't worry about spelling if you find spelling difficult. It's far more important that you use ambitious, adventurous vocabulary than it is whether or not you spelt them right. Having said that, if there are some words in the task, so if it uses words like charity or environment or something like that, if it's in the question, we'll get it right, because there's no excuse. It's right there in front of you. Okay, I don't care whether you haven't got spell check. If the word's right there on the page, you can spell it correctly. Okay, so try not to make stupid mistakes. Try and make sure that names of people and places, names of towns and schools begin with capital letters. And you don't go to Seaford College, you go to Seaford College. Okay, so let's just get basic things like that right. Otherwise, you're just going to irritate an examiner. Okay. So thinking about counter arguments then, for instance, then if you're writing for an open day leaflet, think about the things that parents of prospective Seaford students would be thinking. I'm thinking, what do they ask when they come round on open morning? They say, oh, my child is dyslexic. Can you cater for them? Or my child is going to be the only child coming from their current school. Will that be a problem? Will everyone else know each other? My child really wants to come to Seaford, but they're not really sporty and it's got such a good reputation for sport. Will there be space for them here? Will they find their niche? Will they have friends, or are they going to feel really left out? Think about the things that your reader will be thinking about. If you're writing the leaflet giving advice on how to give up smoking, think about the smoker who picks it up and thinks, well, I've quit 5 times. What's the point in doing it again? There's no point in me trying because my partner smokes. I can't give up smoking because I'm just so stressed, and it helps relieve stress. I don't know what I'd do if I couldn't smoke. Think about those counter arguments and think, how are you going to deal with them? How are you going to quash them? Okay, if you're writing a leaflet encouraging people to take up sport, think about, you're trying to persuade people to join their local rugby club. What if they've never played rugby before? Can they still join? What about if they're worried about getting injured? What about if it's like a paddleboarding club or something, and they'd love to paddleboard, but they can swim, but they're not that strong, and they're really worried about that? Is that an issue? Try to think about what these counter arguments would be. If you're trying to persuade people to give money to a local charity, but what if they haven't got much money? Can they still help? What could they do? Yeah. What about if they're concerned about where the money will go? Is it all just going to go on producing leaflets like this, or is it actually going to go to people who need it? What about if they want to give some money but they haven't got a credit card and they don't do internet banking? How could they give then? Yeah. Try to think about those counter arguments and how you can deal with them and help the audience in some way.